And without further ado, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to Roman Krznaric.
Thanks very much there, Donna. Looking forward to this conversation, seeing where it takes us.
Who knows? The world's in a very different place from when Roman and I first agreed that we would do this session, which was sometime last year. So we're going to explore both books really in the context of the world as it is today. Roman, maybe we can kick off. Would you like to introduce yourself to the group?
Sure. So, yeah, my name's Roman Krznaric. Beautifully pronounced, Donna, by the way. You're Krznaric. So I'm a writer and I'm a social philosopher. Many years ago, I used to be a political scientist, right, 20, 25 years ago, but I left that to pursue other projects outside academia. I helped set up an organization called the School of Life, which still exists, and though I'm no longer directly involved, which is all about emotional intelligence and teaching that. We set up schools and classes and things in 15 different countries. I founded a museum called the Empathy Museum, which gives people the experience of what it's like to be another person. But mostly, I'm an author, really. Um, I've written these books that Donna just mentioned, and other books before that on themes like empathy and finding purposeful work and things like that. Um, and I'm a research fellow at a research center, interdisciplinary research center at Oxford University called the Center for Eudaimonia and Human Flourishing. But in any case, I am delighted to be here and talk to you all.
Wow, that's a very impressive CV, but that's great to see
It's a
you.
bit all over the
And
place, my CV,
I
actually.
love it.
In fact, I haven't even written a proper CV for years and years and years. Luckily, nobody's asked me.
Sounds wonderful to me. Let's go take a deep dive then, Roman, shall we, into the book and the principles of both books in many ways are, what can we learn from history and encourage long-term cathedral thinking, as you call it, in this increasingly short-term and people might say micro-term world. There's a Greek proverb that says, "Society grows great when old men plant trees under which the shade of which they'll never sit under." And I think you mention in your book the great tragedy of our era is that we are living as citizens of the present rather than as ancestors of the future. So I guess the is how do we change that deeply embedded and increasingly short-term thinking, particularly of our leaders in business and in politics? That's a biggie to kick off the
Yeah, in
session.
fact, that's the whole project of my life, in a sense. I think answering a question like that is really about where the starting point is for thinking about that. And one place I start thinking is inside our own brains. Who are we? What are we? And I always think of myself of having that we have both a marshmallow brain and an acorn brain. And our marshmallow brain is the part of our brains, ancient part of our brains, which is all about instant gratification, and things like that, immediate responses. And of course, that's what's always in operation when the social media platforms are trying to get us to keep scrolling, to keep clicking, and so on. And of course, it's named after the famous marshmallow test from the 1960s, the psychology test where when a marshmallow was put in front of kids, and if they could resist eating it for 15 minutes, they were rewarded with a second marshmallow. But of course, we are not just marshmallow thinkers. We also have deeply embedded here in our dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, we have what I think of as the acorn brain. That's the part of our brain that has a capacity for long-term planning and thinking and strategizing. And it's a new part of the brain, right? It's only a couple of million years old compared to the 80 million year old marshmallow brain, which we share with rats and other species. But the thing about the acorn brain is that compared to most other creatures, we're actually pretty good at this kind of long-term thinking. Like, as you say, with that lovely proverb about planting seeds in the ground where future generations might benefit from it. So if you think of chimpanzee, right? A chimpanzee will plan ahead a bit. They'll get a stick, strip off the leaves and turn it into a tool to poke into a termite hole. But they'll never make a dozen of those tools and set them aside for next week. But that's what we're actually really good at. And you can think about this in terms of cathedral thinking, as you mentioned, that idea that we actually historically, you can look at our species. What have we done? We've been, you know, in medieval Europe, putting down the foundation stones of a cathedral, knowing it would never be finished within our lifetimes, yet people still went on with those projects, which sometimes took hundreds of years to complete. But we've done it with the pyramids, the Great Wall of China, the Channel Tunnel, you know, uh, the James Webb Space Telescope, the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, collecting millions of seeds in an indestructible rock bunker in the Arctic Circle that's designed to last for 1,000 years. So in a sense, my answer to the question, in short, is one of the things we need to always remember in our short-term world where we are looking at our phones and clicking the buy now button is that actually this is not the full story of who we are. You know, we need to open up our imaginations to, in a way, the biological and historical memory that we have a capacity to think beyond the here and now, and we need to learn to tap into it in a way to bring that Greek proverb to life.
But you'd think we'd have talked about this before, and we haven't, because that leads me perfectly into my next question, which considers some of the writing in History for Tomorrow, and you explore, as you do actually in your recent TED talk, which I loved, you explore lessons from ancient societies. And whether I'm just attuned to it, but I'm hearing so much more about learning from lessons of ancient society and indigenous cultures. And I was really interested in the Japanese Edo era lessons that you talk about in your TED talk. Can you share with us lessons from ancient cultures that you feel could be relevant today? And I mean, the world is, my phrase is, in a right old pickle. And I've been saying that. So whatever is the extreme version of being in a pickle is where we are. But what, in your view, what lessons from ancient cultures could we apply right here, right now?
Yeah, so this new recent book of mine, History for Tomorrow, has just come out. Um, you know, the way it's structured, as you know, is that it looks at 10 challenges facing society in the 21st century, from the climate emergency to hyperconsumerism to threats to democracy to risks from AI, and ask what can we learn from the last 1,000 years of history to help us think about those issues in more effective ways. And so, you know, part of the question, you know, in just response to your question is sort of what direction do we go in here? I mean, let me just think of, you know, one example. For example, you mentioned Edo, Japan in the 18th century. So I do talk about 18th century Japan. Why? Well, the reason I write about that is partly because of what I see in my local shopping center. If I go to I live in Oxford in the UK. And, you know, if I go to my local shopping center, it's this sort of massive thing. And this is where everybody is on the weekend, you know, including my teenage kids sometimes. You know, they're not at church, they're shopping, you know, and yet, of course, we know that our culture of hyper-consumerism is pushing our planet over perilous planetary tipping points of biodiversity loss and climate change and ocean acidification and plastics use and all these things. And sometimes I look at that shopping center, I think like this culture of I shop, therefore I am is impossible to challenge. It is just so dominant. Can we run our economies in a different way? You know? And actually, this is where I think history comes in. You can find examples where at a large scale, economies have been run in very, very different ways, not so much focused on, you know, hyper-consumerism. And I think Japan in the 18th century is a good example. So just imagine you are standing on the old wooden Nihonbashi Bridge in the ancient Japanese city of Edo, now known as Tokyo. And there are people chatting their lovely kimonos. There are people pushing, you know, seafood traders going across to the fish market on the other side, laborers pushing cartloads of rice. And what was remarkable about Edo was it wasn't just a huge city over 1 million people, so far larger than London or Paris at the time. It also operated what we would today call a circular economy, where almost everything was, reused, repaired, repurposed, recycled. And that was partly because, Japan at the time wasn't trading much with the outside world, and they were having to be self-sufficient when it came to cotton and wood. There were shortages. So one of the things that developed because of shortages of cloth was that a tradition of patchwork developed known as boro, meaning tattered rags where fragments of old cotton were sewn into garments that were then passed on down the generations. And I'm actually wearing right here, right now, a traditional borrowed jacket that you can see. Maybe you can see it there, which is over 100 years old. It's a kind of patchwork jacket. It's an embodiment of a different kind of economy. And it wasn't just patchwork that they did. There were thousands of circular businesses in Edo, Japan, collecting used candle wax drippings to be remolded, repairing old umbrellas. Traders would even come to your home and pay you for your human waste, which they then sell on as agricultural fertilizers. So Edo in the 18th century was one of the world's first large-scale examples of a low-waste, low-carbon ecological civilization. And as I point out in my new TED Talk, which just came out a few days ago on this, I look at a couple of other topics as well. Japan certainly wasn't a utopia by any means. It was a feudal society. It was a patriarchal society. But if you think about we can learn, I think, 300 years later, in a sense, if we want to adopt the mindset of Edonomics today, what would we do? Well, if you imagine a standard smartphone, we wouldn't really permit those for sale because we know a standard smartphone uses over half of the elements in the periodic table, all those rare earth metals, and is thrown away on average after less than 3 years. Instead, if we were thinking Edonomic style, we would have, the only phones permitted for sale would be, have recycled metals and be modular by design with easily replaceable screens and batteries, like the Dutch Fairphone, is one example. And I think, we don't need a military dictatorship as happened in Edo, Japan, in order to do this. We just need sensible regulation to create a different kind of Edonomic style operating space. So this is just one kind of example from history, which I think, it's not these examples from history are not about blueprints. They're about kind of inspiration. That's how I think about it more, kind of an opening up of our imagination to sort of look at our world and think, it doesn't have to be this way. Because I think so often we just sort of think like, this is the only way an economy can be, or this is the only way that democracy can be. But in fact, there's so many other ways. And we can talk about other examples if you like how do we deal with the sort of Trump style far right populism? What does history teach us about that? And so on. But I think history is really, it's a kind of an imaginative kind of acupuncture in a way to open our imaginations.
Mm. That's really interesting insofar as obviously as the young woman who held up a sign yesterday at the Trump conference saying, "This is not normal. This is not normal." We've designed and become part of a self-destructive rather than regenerative and distributive economy. We are destroying our planet and ourselves. It's not normal, and it doesn't have to be like that. And what excites me about the lessons you talk about, both in History for Tomorrow and The Good Ancestor, these solutions do not, in fact, they do not rely on regulation. It's helpful. I'm sure they didn't have that regulation in Edonomics. They don't rely on, but would be helpful. They do not rely on technological solutions that either don't exist or are unproven, which many seem to be hanging their hat on. It requires a rethinking and a redesign and a different mindset, and a mindset that is more courageous and compassionate. And you talked about empathy, which feels like an attribute that doesn't feature in many boardrooms these days. It certainly isn't high on the list of attributes of the new US administration. How do you see the role of deep intergenerational empathy solving these huge social and climate crises that we're facing? Again, another biggie, but I just think it's one that's never really discussed that much, and certainly not at policy level. But even in business, in the boardroom, where is the compassion and the kindness and the empathy?
Yeah, I think there's also different ways of thinking about this. So, I mean, I definitely, I wrote my book, The Good Ancestor, because I think we should become good ancestors, and that concept is a very compelling one in the sense of we often talk about future generations, but future generations to me often feels very abstract and far away. Being a good ancestor is about us, about me, the decisions I make, the responsibilities that we have, because we know that never before in human history have we had such potentially damaging impacts on the generations to come. We treat the future, we kind of have colonized the future in a sense. We treat it as a dumping ground for our ecological degradation and technological risk and all these things. And so there's a real question there of, in practice, what does it mean to be a good ancestor in business, in politics, and all these different fields? And I see inspiration in lots of different places. So a classic example, which you'll know about, of course, is a company like Faith in Nature, right? British pharmaceutical company where a few years ago, they put nature on the board, right? Legally, you can go to their website and download the kit that you need to put nature on your board. So you have a fiduciary, you've got a duty not just to make money, but to care for the living world and the future generations who will inhabit it. That idea of having a kind of a voice for the voiceless, I think, is very powerful. If you go to I got a email not long ago from the chief of staff of the mayor of Quebec, who was saying that across the province of Quebec, there are over 70 municipalities and towns which now have a chair for future generations in the room when they're making decisions, right? It's decorated by local school kids, and it's symbolic, right? But it's part of trying to bring that idea of intergenerational justice, seventh generation decision making from Native American cultures and things into the room. So I think there are those kinds of ways of doing that, bringing that into business. But I think it's also about a kind of an attitude of cathedral thinking in a sense. I mean, one example that comes to mind with respect to your question is the Danish oil and gas company, former oil and gas company called Dong, D-O-N-G. And in around 2008, 2009, they decided to embark on what they called their 85-15 plan. So to shift from being 85% fossil fuel production and 15% renewable to the other way around. And they thought it would take them 30 years to do this. But in fact, they did it within about 10 years. And by 2018, they rechristened themselves. They changed their name from Dong to Ørsted. And as you probably know, Ørsted controls like 30% of the world's offshore wind power market. And I think it's a really interesting example of cathedral thinking, taking that long view for an adaptability to the changing world and the crises-ridden world that we live in. But what I also like about their example is when you look into that example of how Ørsted developed is it was messy. It was difficult. There were all sorts of boardroom fights and so on. And yet they kind of persevered with a vision that they wanted to kind of be good ancestors, as it were, but also enable their business to thrive for the long term, right? So I think there's something very important there about combining a kind of a mindset of adaptability with that longer term vision, which I think businesses can kind of tap into. But something else, another kind of relevant example here may be that I came across when I was writing History for Tomorrow, was I ended up looking a lot at the amazing Italian region of Emilia Romagna, about 4 or 5 million people. Capital is Bologna. And the interesting thing about Emilia Romagna, from a kind of business point of view, is that 1/3 of the GDP is generated by cooperatives. And about 1/3 of people work in cooperatives or steward-owned companies. And Emilia Romagna has a long, in fact, if you go to Bologna, you don't even realize that the place is full of cooperatives. It's just so normal. You see it. The main supermarket chain is called the Co-op. It's one of Italy's biggest supermarket chains. But it's high tech manufacturing of cooperatives as well, and wine growing, and bars, and all sorts of stuff. Um, and it has very deep roots. It goes back to 19th century mutual aid societies and cooperatives. It even goes back earlier to medieval communal um, forms of organization. The University of Bologna was originally run basically by its students for its first 300 years, who employed the lecturers and kicked them out if they were boring, right? But I think there's a message there, because after the 2008 financial crash, actually Emilia-Romagna weathered it better than basically almost any region in Europe, right? Because the evidence seems to suggest the fact that they were worker owned, this was economic democracy in practice, meant that they were able to adjust. So they could say to workers in their companies, well, look, you're going to have to take a pay cut of 20%, but this is going to help us survive through this time. And then we'll put your salary back up to where it was before. The kind of thing that's harder to do in more standard company structures. And I think there's a message there as we start becoming more creative about the design of business, to think about what are the kinds of designs which enable resilience and holding on to values. And in fact, just yesterday, and you probably know him, Erinch Sahan, who's the business
Mm.
lead of Donut Economics Action Lab. He just launched with his team a set of, I think, 24 case studies. I couldn't
Mm.
go along to the launch yesterday, but I was talking to him a few days ago about it. 24 case studies of steward-owned, mostly steward-owned companies, or who've taken the design of business to a sort of a deeper level with these kind of models, or the kind of Patagonia style models, where the shares have been
Mm.
shifted into a trust, where the duty is to the planet Earth. So I think thinking about the design of business is really fundamental for these times, and for taking that longer view, for creating a culture of a longer now.
Mm. I love that. And I was at that launch and it really lifted my day. That there will be a recording available anytime soon, I think, of the launch of the deal case studies. And again, we have the solutions. There are communities all across the world and here in the UK who are adopting a cooperative style model and recognize. And I guess we did that a little bit during the pandemic, didn't we? People in times of crises will support each other, will recognize complementary skills and resource and help each other in the local community. And we are in a time of crisis, and we need to do that at home, at play, in business, and in government. But I think the more time goes on, the more you realize it's going to come bottom up. And actually, just thinking about reimagining progress. I've got two questions actually, which are interconnected. They have inspired me by what appears, and I don't know how much you want to talk about this, but you talk in the book about engaging in peaceful protests with your teenage children. And the one that really blew my mind, and it feels so simple, yet the lessons from it are incredible, that you gave your votes in the last election in principle and asked your young people. So there's that. And then I want to come on about how do we take those lessons into business at a time when GDP dominates. But we'll leave that for a moment because it's all about courageous and compassionate leadership. So let's talk about courageous and compassionate leadership in the home, in the families that everybody can learn from, if that's all right.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. So actually, back in 2019, my partner and I decided to give our kids an unusual birthday present. They were then 11 years old. We decided to give them our votes in the election of that year. And so we sat around the kitchen table, we discussed the party manifestos and how the system worked, and they then told us where to put the X on the ballot sheet. And they didn't exactly follow how we would vote. Kind of one did and one didn't, but we followed what they said. And actually, since then, we haven't voted. we've always given our children our votes in local and national elections, and they're now 16. So in a couple of years' time, I'll get my vote back, which is rather nice. And of course, on one level, it was this kind of symbolic gesture, because recognizing that our future generations, not just those who aren't born, but those today who will become older, they don't really have a stake or a voice in our politics or the way our economies are run, even though we know they're going to be impacted. And, for us as a family, the classic example was Brexit, right? The Brexit vote, our children thought that Britain should stay in the European Union, and they still think that, but it wasn't them making that decision. It was, of course, there was a large majority of people over the age of 60 who wanted for the UK to leave, and a large majority under 30 who wanted the UK to stay. And who those younger people are going to be living with the consequences of that, obviously. So I think there's something there about, it didn't feel like particularly courageous parenting. It just felt like a kind of an honoring and empathic honoring of our children's future. Because, the way I think about it is, my kids could easily be alive in the year 2100. You know, that year 2100 is not science fiction, but it's an intimate family fact. But it's quite hard often to sort of feel that in our bones. You have to kind of work at that, because you don't need to have children to think about in long term in that way. But it's sort of one route towards it. So yeah, I mean, we've done that in the home. And the other thing I've sort of done, I guess, with my kids, relevant here, is, as you mentioned there, about disruptive action and protest. I mean, writing this book, History for Tomorrow, one of the things that I became very convinced by is the power of disruptive movements to create transformative change.
Mm.
If you think about, I mean, this is just one example in the book, but there are many others. Britain in the 1820s still was presiding over a slave economy. 700,000 enslaved people were working on sugar plantations owned by British organizations and companies in the Caribbean. And at that time, the owners of slave plantations, the financiers, made remarkably similar arguments to today's fossil fuel executives to defend their actions. They sort of admitted that slavery was morally questionable, but they argued that ending it too rapidly could lead to economic collapse. Right? This is exactly what we hear today. So they said slavery should be phased out gradually, just like Shell and so on says we should be carbon net zero, but not until 2050, right? But the remarkable thing that happened was in 1831, there was an uprising called the Great Jamaica Slave Revolt, sometimes called the Baptist War, where over 20,000 enslaved people rose up in rebellion in Jamaica, setting fire to over 200 plantations. And the revolt was crushed brutally, but it sent a wave of panic through the British establishment, who realized that, or they kind of concluded, that if they didn't grant emancipation, then the whole colony might be lost. And this then accelerated the shift to the 1833 Abolition of Slavery Act, which would have taken decades longer probably to enter the statute books if it hadn't been for this radical protest. And you see this pattern through history, that what movements do is they tend to accelerate change. They put things on the political agenda. So the radical splintering of the suffragettes, and you had their radical groups who would be then chaining themselves to the fences and breaking windows, or the civil rights movement. And this is what we're starting to see amongst some of the ecological movements today. And so because of what I've read in the kind of books you can see in my study here, I have found myself, what I've read here about the power of disruptive movements, I found myself lying on the street with my teenage daughter, blocking the roads in front of Parliament in London, exasperated by the government's glacial pace of action on the climate emergency. Now, I'm not a natural protester myself, but I think my conclusion is that it's too late and too risky to leave this issue to simmer on the low flame of gradualism. I cannot think of a better way to be a good ancestor. And I'm not saying that everybody needs to join Just Stop Oil or Extinction Rebellion. There need to be people in every realm, whether it's creating steward-owned companies, or it's working in politics or working in law. But I think it would be quite risky not to have the people on the streets as well, given the urgency of the kind of problems that we have. And so I guess going back to this question of parental courage or parental leadership. In a sense, I've been led by my children on this too, because as you know, my kids are well, one of them particularly is particularly engaged in these kinds of issues. But certainly, what I've learned from writing this book, History for Tomorrow, is that there's something very important about disruption, and disruption does require courage, you know, in any field, because it's like going out on your own. Sometimes you can feel very alone.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I guess we are in such a precarious position as a world. It's almost you can't not do everything you can to leave a world behind that's better than when you inherited. Now that, for some of us, and I include me in here, feels really difficult to achieve right now. And John Burgess has put a very good question in the chat, which I'll ask in a minute. But while we're on that courageous leadership bit, talked about the family. Let's think about the boardroom. Now, we work with businesses, helping them on their B Corp journey. And many of the businesses we work with are led by often males in their 50s, 60s that were brought up on Friedman's School of Economics and shareholder primacy. Now, it takes real courage not only to say to your board, we are going to transition rapidly for all the reasons you've just explained from a shareholder led model to a more regenerative and distributive model. What would you say to leaders that recognize the need to do that in business whilst we are still by the GDP growth narrative? Now, I know, I'm sorry, Roman, I seem to keep firing these huge existential questions, but it's a very real problem, and it's one that we certainly encounter every day.
Yeah, look, you know, I'm just a philosopher. You know, I'm, you know, I don't run a business. I run a small organization, a museum, and so on. So I don't really have an answer based on personal experience uh, around this. And clearly, when you've got those pressures from shareholders or investors who want their 10% or 12%, whatever it is, year on year, it's extraordinarily difficult. You know, I gave a talk a few months ago to a group of 50 tech CEOs in France, from across Europe. And we were talking about this kind of issue and the pressures that they face from their investors to keep, you know, accelerating their speed when they don't, you know, a lot of them have gone into their tech business for very different reasons. You know, they're into AI and they're into, you know, discovering new cures for certain kinds of cancer and stuff, you know, very values led. But the financing models mean that they have to keep delivering really fast. And that means then they sometimes have to compromise on their values in order to expand fast enough to pay the investors and that kind of thing. And it's really, really hard for them because, you know, the pressures are enormous. But, you know, when I was talking to them, I was kind of giving some examples of like the ones you heard Erin Sahan talking about probably yesterday of steward-owned companies in Finland and other places which have gone in a different direction where the leadership have just said, right, we are going to try and go down another route. And so I think part of the answer is about peer-to-peer inspiration. You know, it's about you see somebody doing it and, you know, going down another path. And I think it can give you a kind of permission to go down another route. And I think you've seen this very much in more generally at a larger scale in the adoption of, for example, the donut economics model by various cities across the world, where Amsterdam starts adopting, you know, the donut model as, you know, as its sort of structure for its financing and how it runs its city. And then suddenly Copenhagen says, ah, well, they're doing it, we can do it. Or Barcelona says we can do it. Or Cali in Colombia says we can do it. And so that peer-to-peer inspiration, I think, is a very fundamental part of it. I mean, personally, I get inspired by the historical kind of examples. But But, in the practice of being a leader, maybe those don't hold as much, sort of weight when you're trying to explain to your board how we can go in different direction. I mean, what have you learned about this, Donna, about what works in these kinds of contexts?
I'm quite well known for making leaders cry. And that sounds really bad. But I think we talked earlier about the importance of leaning into the data. I mean, we have all the data we possibly can need from IPCC, from the planetary boundaries, from the societal breakdown. We've got the data. We know the world is in the middle of a meta crisis. We can see the extreme weather impacts right now. We can see the impacts of misinformation and disinformation and overconsumerism and all of the stuff that everybody on this call will be familiar with. So why aren't people motivated to change? Why are emissions continuing to rise? And I think it is that people do not feel the need for change. A little bit like, do you remember the small boat that came over and that 2-year-old child that was laid down dead? And that just hit the headlines because people felt what that meant. It was very personal. And I will often go to a boardroom and talk about the data and then put a picture of my grandson, who's 2, on the screen, and just enable them to feel what that data means for him before he even gets to high school, way before he gets to high school, in terms of the impact of extreme weather events and food scarcity and energy problems and all of that stuff that we're all familiar with. And it just seems to hit a chord. And I don't intentionally go into a boardroom saying, right, I'm going to make you cry, of course, but I think it is really important that we motivate and encourage people to understand the data. That's hugely important from a risk and resilience of businesses perspective. And actually, this is very personal because what you're doing today, the consequences of our decisions every single day as an individual, as a business leader, affect the future that we're creating tomorrow. So I think the answer is trying to help leaders feel the need for change as well as the data.
Yeah, I mean, I really kind of agree with that. Actually, just made me think that not long ago I was giving a speech to the Dutch Senate, and the reason I was kind of there, and I was talking to parties from across the political spectrum, the green left to the far right, and I was thinking about how do I communicate to them, and what the thing I was talking about was what I was trying to lead to was trying to encourage them to set up a new public position called a Future Generations Commissioner, a bit like they have in Wales. So kind of a long-term public policy position. But before I started talking about that, what I did is I took them on a kind of an emotional journey. I got them to close their eyes. So a little bit like you with the showing, a child on the screen. I got them to close their eyes and to imagine a young person in their life who they really cared about, like a grandchild or child or nephew or niece. And then I got them all to kind of take a step forward with their eyes shut to imagine that young person 30 years from today and to think about the joys and the suffering in that young person's life. And then to get them to take a final step forward, imagine that young person is now 90 years old, 90, surrounded by family and friends and loved ones and work colleagues. And I asked them to kind of go and have a look out the window and, what kind of world do you see out there? And I say to them, now come back in. And suddenly you see this 90-year-old stands up and is about to give a birthday speech when suddenly they see a photograph of you, their dead departed ancestor, over on the wall. And they decide to tell the gathered room about something that you did to be a good ancestor, like a positive legacy that you left to their world. And I asked them to imagine for a minute or so, what did that person say about you and the legacy that you left? And, when doing that kind of exercise is very much tapping into that emotional level that you're talking about, which I think is so important because we do have the data. But what I find in doing that kind of exercise is that, and you got to be quite courageous to do something like that, and I've done it in front of politicians and CEOs and so on. But it affects everybody. People see different things out the window. Some people see utopia, some see utopia. But all of this is about, in a way, making a bridge from something personal to something more universal. Because like when I imagine my daughter, as a 90-year-old, she's not alone in the world. She's part of the web of human relationships and part of the web of the planet itself, the air she breathes, the water she drinks. So if I care about her life, I need to care about all life. So I think if you can get people to really feel that, it can be, not always, a way of then opening out these conversations about, well, do we become, an employee ownership trust,
Mm,
as is in one of the questions there in the chat,
mm,
um, can we use these sort of sideways approaches to opening out the conversation? So it's just
mm.
not shut down immediately.
I think, and I know we talked about this just before we started the session about what are we going to ask the group to discuss in breakout rooms. So we're going to go into breakout rooms for 10 minutes or so now. But I think, Roman, what you've just said feels so perfect. Imagine when you're a young person you care about is 10 years, 50 years, is 90, and they look at your photo. What do you want them to say about the part you played in creating the world that they live in that time? Shall we go for that? Let me see everybody's faces and see if that's terrified them. You
They
all
look
up for that?
terrified. No, they look ready.
Okay, so imagine a person that you really care about, that you love, and fast forward, they're 90, they're giving their birthday speech, and they look at your photo. What are they going to say about you and the world, the part you played in the world that is their world at that time? Okay, let's go. I'll see you. I'll put Roman, you'll be in a room with a couple of people if that's all right. And so will I, and we'll come back in about 10 minutes or so. Okay? Well, wow, what a question, Roman. And there is never enough time, is there, for these conversations? Uh, I'm kind of blown away really by that question, which obviously replaced our original. Can I just ask if anybody has feedback from that session, that conversation that they'd like to share? I'm not going to pick on anyone, which is my default modus operandi. Anything that you'd like to share that you've learned, anything that's going to happen differently?
Happy to share from our breakout room, Rachel Dagger. I had Rachel Pryor in our group and Rob Hall. I think me and Rob had a similar views that we were looking at it from the point of view. Rob was looking at it from they wanted to say his grandkids to say that granddad cared, that they made a space in a world that they were free to be themselves in. I had a similar view. My daughters, I'd love them to be when they're 90 years old to go, Mum did her bit. She played her role. And Rachel shared a really great story about somebody who referred to their mother as being a storm, being somebody who just created change and lived the life that they wanted to live and played their part in supporting people and their environment. So I love that. I want my children to think of me as a storm. I think that's brilliant. And then we talked about like progressive generations, the fact that we look at our ancestors and we go, they didn't do enough or they weren't progressive enough. But that's with our hindsight of how much change is developing. So again, we kind of hope that when our grandchildren are 90 years old, that they will look and go, how are we having these conversations? We've moved on so far, and look at it in dismay that we're talking like this, because hopefully so much change has happened. And we talked about consumerism. We talked about, Roman, your lovely jacket and things like that, about how we can change that conversation. So if we can be part of the conversation that maybe puts your jacket on the front of Vogue, it might change consumerism habits. So that in 90 years, when our kids are 90, they'll go, what were they talking about? Shein and fast fashion. We all go back to our seamstress roots and we all repair and care. So what was all of that all about in the 2025s? So that's our conversation, but it was really, really wonderful input from Rachel and Rob as well. Really nice conversation.
Thank you, Rachel. Fran, did you have something to share?
Well, I just put my highlights in the chat because there's so much. That was a way of summarizing it. So that was a huge gift from Chris, actually, because it's so easy to get hung up. And I was saying, from a marketing and comms background that I come from, often a lot of these things are communication challenges. So I've been trying to write my purpose for a couple of years now, and I'm failing. And the idea of it not being about achievement, it being that I was thinking about all the people who perished in the Baptist War. They didn't even know that 2 years later the Abolition Act was passed, but they did it. And so it's not about kind of knocking up, having awards or whatever and qualifications and things. It's actually about actually tangibly, bravely stepping into these debates. So that was, I'm hugely grateful for that, and for this chat this morning. It's been amazing.
Thank you. Anybody else got anything they'd like to share? No.
Can I maybe just say one final thing? Because I mean,
please do.
Are we about to end? I don't know what the timings are, but just hearing you speak and reflecting this conversation, sometimes it seems to me that there's like two fundamental words we always have to carry with us in our back pockets, and it's this: as if. And what I mean by that is we always have to act as if change is possible, even when it feels like the odds are against you. Those who rose up against British colonialism in India surely didn't think it was going to be easy to achieve their aims, but they acted as if they could. And I think, going back what you were asking about courage earlier, Donna, I think to recognize that as ifness has powered change throughout history in many realms. And when I think about my own life, and sometimes, my wife and I this morning, we both woke up at 5 o'clock and we were just pulling our hair out about Trump, thinking about like, what can we do? Or are we doing the right thing? Or should we change course, or the chaos, etc.? And what we came down to was this sort of sense of, I guess, two things in a way. One is, don't abandon immediately what you're doing. Hold on to what you care about and act as if you can create the change.
Yes, hurrah for that. What if and why, what if and as if, just a beautiful collection of questions to ask. And mine is, we knew, what did we do? Whether it's being differently or doing differently, I think is a perfect end to this very special session. Roman, we're so grateful. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm sure that everybody on this screen will go and reflect on what we've talked about today. Hopefully, also, if they haven't done so already, read your books, look at your TED Talk, and keep in touch. But thank you, really appreciate it. Our next session, for those that would like to come, is on the 5th of June. We've got Rachel Orr from Climate Outreach, another different slant, but very much, we need to do more and more effectively and collectively. So thanks a million, everybody, for joining in this important conversation. Huge thanks to Roman, and keep up the good work, everybody.
And thank you, Donna, much. And thanks to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. 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 Bye.
Thank you.